I would just very quickly rush through economic gains from a transparent, open procurement system, concerns particularly for a developing country for preserving policy space in government procurement. I would also discuss various estimates of size of the government procurement market in India. One estimate has been mentioned earlier, which is 30% of the GDP. Thereafter, quickly go through some of the procurement systems in India, what changes have been brought about, what changes are contemplated in the public procurement bill, and finally, why is India not a signatory to the WTO? And that will link very well with the previous presentation, particularly on the data aspects as well. So the scope of procurement under government procurement agreement, or in general under various international regimes under this, really covers goods, construction services, construction and services as well. It may include procurement not only by the governments itself, but also procurement by state-owned enterprises, what in Indian parlance are called public sector undertakings. And throughout my presentation, I would try to make comparisons between the systems as they exist in India and what is generally mandated by the GPA. So GPA we take as the gold standard. Clearly, there is considerable interest in procurement regimes all over the world for the very simple reason that the size of procurement is a huge market, no doubt about it. But the size can range between 5 to 15%. OECD at one point in time had estimated to be 7.1%, which perhaps seems to be slightly lower. Interesting thing is, if you compare what are OECD's projections and what is actually procured, we did an analysis of Japan, and what is actually procured by the Japanese government above the threshold is perhaps less than half of what is projected by OECD. The reason of this gap is simple. What OECD does is it uses national account statistics, national income statistics to make its projections, which may or may not have linkages with what is actually procured. So it's important to bear in mind that the size of procurement markets, as is projected by various studies, which are generally based on national income accounting statistics, may be a bit off the mark, to put it rather mildly. Then, of course, procurement, particularly in developing countries, is an essential function of the government, vital for delivery of socially important goals. We saw in Brazil, for example, how there are some preferences given. The basic reason why preferences are given in Brazil, as well as in the United States, is supposedly to achieve certain socio-economic objectives. Whether these objectives are achieved is, of course, a different story. Of course, no need to recount the benefits of a transparent regime here amongst such a knowledgeable audience. But it's also useful to recognize that in terms of gains, there was a very interesting study by Dierdorf and Stern when they tried to quantify what was the potential benefits arising from tariff liberalization from the Tokyo round, which concluded in 1979, and benefits from liberalizing world procurement markets. The conclusion of the study was fairly clear. Benefits from tariff liberalization were far less than benefits from liberalizing government procurement markets. So I think that is one important aspect which we do need to bear in mind. Liberalization of government procurement markets will certainly go a long way in enhancing consumer welfare world over. But then certainly concerns remain. Let me give you the concerns from a developing country perspective. Firstly, the administrative cost of implementation may be extremely high. And one of the problems in administrative cost of implementation goes back to notification obligations on procurement statistics. I want all of you to make a guess over here. When did European Union make its first notification to the WTO's Government Procurement Committee of its procurement statistics? It was supposed to have made it sometime in 97 or 98. Make a guess, when did EU first do it? That, I think, will underline the difficulties in compiling procurement statistics. Anyone?
Hasn't done it yet.
Well, it's not that bad. Gary, you wanted...
85, I was going to give
84.
No, it was supposed to have made the notification sometime in 96 or 97.
64 then.
Last year.
Oh, well, first time it was in 2007. So it was after a gap of almost 11 to 12 years. That underscores how even collecting basic statistics becomes a problem. If that is a problem for the European Union, you can well imagine problem in other countries, particularly developing countries. Why I am laboring this point is that while there will be economic gains to be made from an open, transparent procurement systems, there are administrative costs, and notification obligations is perhaps one of an important source of cost. The second is, as rightly mentioned earlier, in many of the developing countries, we do not have bid challenge procedures. Putting into place new administrative structures which will ensure an independent and expeditious bid challenge procedure can certainly be costly. Thereafter, if one ends up taking international obligations on government procurement, there is a possibility of government policy space being curtailed. As I mentioned earlier, government procurement has been used as an instrument for achieving important socio-economic goals. Even United States, keep aside the issue of those offsets for small business, offsets for minorities, offsets for women, or offsets in the hub zones. Even at the time of the global economic crisis, even United States did not shy away from using public procurement as an instrument to give fillip to its local economy. If that is a reality, clearly there will be concerns in a country like India if there is a move to take obligations under government procurement or even obligations under the FTA negotiations with the European Union. So what is required is striking some sort of a balance between the elbow room which the government might want to retain and an open, transparent, and non-discriminatory procurement system. Size of the Indian procurement market. Well, India does not provide the way the data is, data is not readily available on what is procured. That's number one. But various estimates have been made of the size of government procurement market. One estimate puts it at a rather low level of 3.6 to 5.9%. This estimate was based on some work using national income accounting statistics. Thereafter, in 2007, we tried to make some assessment based on the actual accounting data of the central government and some of the state governments. And there we arrived at a figure of around 80 odd billion, which at that point in time was close to about 14% of the GDP. Subsequently, a couple of years back, we did this exercise again, and we came to a figure of about 142 billion, which represents around 12% of GDP, which is just slightly below in absolute value, slightly below your estimates. But you also mentioned a figure of 30%. Now, let me give you some background of this 30% figure. There was a conference a couple of years back where the Chief Vigilance Commissioner, he made a presentation, and out of the hat he came out with a figure of 30%. That figure of 30% got quoted in a report written by Robert Anderson of the WTO Secretariat. And I, for one, have not been able to figure out from where Mr. Pratyush Sinha could get this figure of 30%. But the short point is that it's not a small market. Procurement in India takes place at various levels. At the level of the federal government, what we refer to as the central government, thereafter also in about 27 provinces, and in addition to these specific governments, procurement also takes place through what I said was public sector enterprises at the central level plus at the state level. At the central level, on a rough count, there would be around 500 such entities. At the state level, we have no idea, but I would stick my neck out and say that there would be close to around 2,000 such entities. And the way our estimates about procurement are at the central government level, the procurement is around 45 billion US dollars. All the state governments taken together around 23, 24 billion US dollars. So the governments at both the levels combined is close to 70 billion. And around same value of procurement is done by the public sector undertakings at the central and the state level. Now, what is procured? Again, we do not have a very clear idea since we do not have detailed statistics. But looking at the accounting data plus the balance sheets of some of these entities plus the websites, one can say that the pattern of procurement of both these entities, central and state governments, are quite different from what is procured by the public sector enterprises. The public sector enterprises are involved in all types of business, from steel making, aluminium making, producing energy, petroleum refining, producing pharmaceuticals. So clearly, machinery and equipment, raw material like coking coal, iron ore, these would figure prominently in procurement by the central and state entities. Whereas at the level of, sorry.
Can I just ask, when the central government figures there, are you including in those departmental undertakings as well?
We are including railways and telecom as well. Both are included. Because in India, they are treated as part of the central government. Whereas when we look at what the central and state governments procure, there the pattern of procurement would include items like clothing, it would include medical services, it would include pharmaceuticals, it would also include financial services, which also is quite prominently procured by the PSUs. Now, this size of about 142 billion US dollars, our assessment is it includes all types of procurement, above GPA threshold and below GPA threshold. So that procurement which is likely to be above GPA threshold might be a bit lower than this. Regulatory regime in India, we do not have an overarching law on government procurement, either at the level of the central government or in most of the states. Two of these states in the southern part of the country are experimenting with a law on government procurement, but the extent to which the laws in these two states have been successful is open to a fair bit of question. So the question which all of you might think is, if there is no law governing procurement, then is it Wild West situation prevailing in India where government can arbitrarily discriminate and like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland decide what to procure from where without following any rules? Well, the reality is not that bad. We do have something called the General Financial Rules, and that prescribes rules regarding procurement. These rules were fairly archaic, outdated at the central government level. GFR 1963, these remained in existence for close to about 40 odd years, and these were subsequently revised in 2005. Now the interesting part is that potentially the state-owned entities, that is the public sector enterprises, are not mandated to follow the requirements of general financial rules. The state governments can have their own rules on procurement. So in effect, you would have a situation where one rule for the central government, 27 different rules for the states, 500 rules for the state-owned enterprises at the central government level, and about 2,000 odd different rules for the state-owned enterprises at the state government level. So close to about 2,500 different sets of rules. But luckily, there is some method in madness in India. The method is the following. Most of the procuring entities at the central government level follow GFRs with very minor deviations. And the deviations really are add-on to the GFRs. They end up detailing the GFRs further. So I would say there is not much deviation in the procurement rules at the central government level between what the general financial rules prescribe and what the state-owned enterprises end up following. A very quick comparison of GFR 2005 and GFR 1963 to highlight the gradual movement towards some transparency. Some would say, well, the gradual movement is more at a snail's pace. But well, in India, things really move rather slowly. So in terms of preferences, GFR 1963 explicitly mentioned that Indian goods have preference over imported goods. This explicit statement of preference was removed in GFR 2005. So under GFR 2005, Indian and imported goods are expected to be treated at par, subject to certain exceptions, of course. GFR of 1963 never even envisaged the possibility of services being procured. So there were no rules on procurement of services, whereas GFR 2005 does provide some rules on procurement of services, but that is mainly for consultants. Lots need to be added from the services perspective. Thereafter, bidding guidelines, archaic bidding guidelines were prevalent in GFR 1963, but now in GFR 2005, the guidelines have evolved quite a bit, and despite what Steve said about UNCITRAL and some of the others, the bidding guidelines in GFR 2005 are closer to what is mandated in some, let's say, World Bank procurement procedures. So again, there is a gradual shift towards increased transparency. What are the various types of procurement? First, of course, is the advertised tender. Any procurement whose value exceeds the 50,000 US dollars is mandatorily required to be advertised in the Indian Trade Journal. The website should contain the tender document, the timings of the procurement process, and in general, potentially anyone can bid for the tender if the value of the proposed contract exceeds the $50,000. Then we also have a system of limited tendering, generally where the value of tender is around below $25,000, where the tender documents are sent only to the registered suppliers. Who can become a registered supplier? I would come subsequently. And finally, there is also a system whereby the tendering is done, the procurement is done through a single tender. This is supposed to be sought recourse to when the value of procurement is not very high, certainly much below the threshold of $25,000, and the procuring entity is required to give valid reasons why it resorted to the single tender procedure. And of course, there is also a requirement that the procuring entity must very clearly specify that it had knowledge that only one firm manufactures the good which is going to be procured. There is also a possibility that the procuring entity can float what is called an international tender. And there are certain situations in which international tenders can be sought, usually when there is lack of competitive suppliers for India, or where the quantities manufactured in India is insufficient. So in order to encourage more competition, in order to encourage that there will be sufficient quantity of goods available to be procured, the system of international tenders is followed. Now, what are the selection criteria? Selection criteria has to be explicitly written in the tender document itself. Now, all this I'm mentioning is for GFR 2005, which applies for the central government. There are deviations at the state level, which I will come later. there should not be any deviation from the selection criteria as specified in the tender document. Then the decisions must not be arbitrary and they must pass the test of equality of opportunity. Of course, in the tender document itself, there is a requirement to specify whether it's an international tender or it's limited to just Indian firms. And there should not be any major relaxation in the specifications, and the tender conditions. Of course, this becomes contentious. What does major relaxation mean? The basis of selection, as was mentioned earlier, it generally ends up with the L1, what we say, the lowest tenderer. So clearly we may not be able to reap economic benefits through an efficient procurement system, because inevitably the lowest evaluated responsive tender tends to be awarded the contract. But before the contract is awarded to the lowest responsive evaluated tenderer, there is a process whereby the procuring entity is expected to check whether the price which has been quoted is reasonable. In terms of, it shouldn't be too low, it shouldn't be too high. But there is no clarity on how this reasonableness is ascertained by the procuring entity. I mentioned that there is a system whereby a limited tendering procedure can be followed if the size of procurement is less than $25,000, and that is through sending out the tender documents to certain registered suppliers. Now, the registration of suppliers is really valid for any time between 1 to 3 years. Any supplier who wants to get registered can seek registration at any point in time, and the criteria for registration I have just mentioned over here: credentials, manufacturing capability, quality control systems, past performance, after-sales service, financial background. He need not have excellent performance on each of these. In other words, it is not necessary that he must have participated, or he must have been beneficiary, or he must have successfully bid for a procurement earlier. Even if he has not succeeded in a past procurement contract, if his credentials are okay, or if he has the manufacturing capability, he can potentially become a registered supplier. In parallel to the improvements through the General Financial Rules 2005, one very important development took place when the Central Vigilance Commissioner in India, who took upon himself the responsibility of cleaning up the procurement system. Now, this is one aspect which is not very frequently highlighted, but the contribution of the CVC initiatives on transparency have been huge. One of the first things which the CVC initiatives sought to do was that each procuring entity at the level of central government was mandated to put on its website details of the forthcoming tender process. That was one. The second was CVC decided to start scrutinizing high-value procurements undertaken by entities at the central government level plus the central PSUs. The net result of both these initiatives were the following. We now have, for the central government plus central PSUs, excellent websites giving not only information on the forthcoming tenders, they also give us information of the past tenders. Although the format of the website is not standardized, it can significantly be improved, but some of the procuring entities also give copious information of what was sought to be procured, who all bid, who all were considered to be responsive bidders, to whom was the contract awarded, and what was the value of the contract. I wish all the procuring entities at the central government level could follow a uniform pattern. If that is done, then certainly it would lead to greater information, it would generate more information, it would help research, it would also help others as well. But at this juncture, we do not have a system where either we have one central procurement portal or a system whereby we may not have one central procurement portal, but standardized information being made available. But definitely it's a very, very useful step. This has been up and running for the past about 4 or 5 years and reasonably successful. Prior to this, it was almost impossible in India to find out who is procuring how much, unless you went to the office of the procuring entity, sat on the head of the main procuring officer, who would stonewall all attempts at sharing information, unless you put in a parliament question. That could have been one way, but that would have been a very tortuous route. So now we have a fair bit of information available. And in fact, when we were making this estimate of 142 billion, it was some of these websites which gave us huge amount of information. Then the guidelines on scrutiny of high-value procurement, this works at 2 levels. The Central Vigilance Commissioner has his own offices in each of the procuring entities, and they have to abide by his guidelines. They have to ensure transparency and probity in government procurement. And not only that, they have to send cases to the CVC of high-value contracts, so that CVC in turn assures himself that there was the expected standards which were required to be met were actually met. But this is, as I said earlier, this is one of the unsaid stories of how behind the scenes, in a very understated manner, the procurement system in India, at least at the central government level, has seen considerable improvement in terms of transparency. What are the gaps in procurement practices in India? The central government procurement system generally conforms to the norms of GPA. I would say generally, but deviations do exist. Against the minimum period of 40 days between the tender and the receipt of responses, at the central government level, just about 3 to 4 weeks are provided. This certainly can be increased to 40 days. But a bigger concern is that the procuring entities retain the discretion whether to confine the procurement to just Indian suppliers or to float an international global tender. Then contract award notices were generally not published earlier, were not brought in the public domain till the CVC guidelines came into operation. Now the situation has changed considerably. Each procuring entity on its website not only displays information about the forthcoming tender, but it also says to whom was the tender awarded. But there is no mandatory requirement to specify what was the value of the tender. But many entities on their own, why many? I would say most of the entities on their own are also disclosing the value at which the tender was awarded. Then reasons are rarely given to unsuccessful bidders. This system whereby there's a debriefing of unsuccessful bidders, that system does not prevail in India. And the bid challenge procedure, particularly at the pre-award stage, is completely lacking. Well, the concerns at the state government level are much more severe. The gaps between what the government procurement agreement requires and the systems which are prevalent are quite dismal. In fact, some of the state governments still follow procurement rules which go back to the British times. Maybe the procurement systems are 70, 80 years old. And it's very unlikely that unless there's a huge political will to change it, large-scale changes will come in the near future. So World Bank had done a fairly detailed assessment of procurement systems in some of the states, and it was quite an eye-opener when it did the assessment of a very important state in India called Uttar Pradesh. The findings of the World Bank country assessment were the following. The time for bid submission were unrealistic. In certain cases, just about a week or 10 days. Then the qualifications for eligible bidders were rarely stated. And when the qualifications were specified, they were perhaps inappropriate for the work or for the procurement. Technical specifications were skewed, and the criteria and methodology for evaluation and comparison were just not disclosed. So clearly at the level of the provinces, at the level of state government, both the state government as well as the SOEs at the state government level, there is a huge gap between what exists and what ought to be. Those of you who follow developments in India might be aware that for the past 2-3 years, India has been beset with 3 or 4 very, very high-profile corruption cases. These cases related to not government procuring, but government selling spectrum to telecom companies, government leasing out mining blocks for coal. So this was the background in which there was huge uproar within the country that there is a need to do something with our procurement systems. So as a response, the government had set up a committee under the chairmanship of the former head of the Competition Authority. And he came up with a report on which I think out of the 30-odd members who were part of the committee, 28 or 29 had dissenting opinion in the entire report, including some people dissented on the dissenting note as well. But the only good which came out of this Dhal committee was its recommendation that the government must, at least at the central government level, have an overarching bill on public procurement. So this bill was introduced in Parliament in May 2012. It is currently undergoing scrutiny by a select group of members. While it may not be passed in the coming 3 or 4 months, I remain optimistic that certainly before the tenure of the current government ends, it will be passed. Because the current government at the central level is under huge pressure to show that it has taken some action to fight corruption. And this will be a very big achievement, a major feather in its cap, if it's able to get the public procurement bill passed. What all does the public procurement bill do? The most important thing which it does is it goes beyond the GFR, broadens the scope of coverage. Thereafter, concern for prevention is very, very pronounced. And then there is a fairly detailed grievance redressal mechanism. Now, as many of you have highlighted, rules are not sufficient. It's how the rules are implemented on the ground at the end of the day that is what will determine whether the procurement system results in value for money or not. But we are not yet at that stage. Quickly, let's go through the brief objectives of the public procurement bill. The basic objectives are ensuring transparency, accountability, probity, fair and equitable treatment of bidders, promoting competition, enhancing efficiency, and maintaining integrity and public confidence in the government procurement system. And let's not undermine the importance of the last tiret over here. The confidence of public as well as of potential bidders in the procurement system in India, if it's not at the rock bottom, it's somewhere fairly close to rock bottom at this juncture, given the scandals. Now, the interesting part over there is that the corruption scandals which beset the central government were really in situations where the government was selling something. Interestingly, the public procurement bill does not cover those aspects. It is confined just to government procuring. It does not extend itself to when government sells or gives concessions. So that is something which I don't know whether it's intentional or it's an oversight. Applicability, it goes beyond central ministries. In other words, we will now have one law which will cover all the central government ministries and the 500-odd public sector enterprises of the central government. It's not applicable for tenders which will be below $100,000 or for emergent procurement or procurement concerning national security. In other words, to a large extent, defense procurement unlike US, will be kept outside the purview of the Public Procurement Bill. The transparency requirements, first and foremost, maintaining one central procurement website, which will have all possible details about procurement. It will have details regarding the pre-qualification document, bidder registration document, bidding document, if for a particular tender, who all bid, details of the successful bidder, including the bid price. For others, the bid price need not be disclosed, but their details will be provided. In addition, the website will also mention if there was any complaint raised by a bidder or a potential bidder, then what was the complaint and how was his complaint handled. This, I think, is a very important initiative envisaged under the Public Procurement Bill. Non-discrimination requirement: the procuring entity shall generally not discriminate between different suppliers or different groups of suppliers, but in limited circumstances, government might provide for purchase preference. In other words, there is a possibility, rather the possibility still exists, that by notification, government might end up discriminating against foreign bidders. Coming to the grievance redressal mechanism, the grievance redressal mechanism is really a two-tier process. In the first instance, during the procurement process itself, any bidder or a potential bidder who feels aggrieved by any decision in the procurement process can approach the procuring entity within 10 days of such a decision having been taken by the procuring entity. And if he is not satisfied by the decision of the procuring entity on his complaint, then he can go to an independent procurement redressal committee. Now, the importance is, the difference over here is that the procuring, in the first stage, the complaint goes to people who are involved in the procurement, whereas the second tier will comprise members who are no way connected with procurement. This, in a way, will meet the requirement of an independent and hopefully an expeditious grievance redressal mechanism as well. So as I was mentioning, any bidder or prospective bidder who is aggrieved by any decision, action, omission of the procuring entity can potentially take recourse to the grievance redressal mechanism. And this is available at any stage of the procurement process. A quick look at the time frames. A decision is taken by the procuring entity. Any aggrieved party can file a petition to the procuring entity within 10 days of the decision. This has to be disposed of by the procuring entity within 30 days. If the procuring entity does not dispose of the complaint within 30 days, or the manner in which it has disposed of the complaint is not satisfactory to the complainant, then he can go to the procurement redressal committee. Procurement within 15 days after the decision, the procurement redressal committee can make its recommendations within 30 days, and the procuring entity in turn has another 15 days to either accept or reject the recommendation of the PRC. If it accepts the recommendation, well and good. If it rejects, it has to give recommendations. An important point to note over here is that the PRC can even recommend suspension of the procurement procedure. The Public Procurement Bill also envisages an integrity pact in order to control corruption. It envisages directives on what conducts are unacceptable, both from the side of the government officials involved in procurement as well as the prospective bidders. And then there are penalties for unethical acts. Hopefully this integrity pact will lead to better understanding between the procuring entities and the bidders. Coming to the last part of my presentation, India's commitments at the WTO and in FTAs. As mentioned earlier, India is not a party to the plurilateral GPA. It's only an observer. Sometime in 2010, it became an observer. it has so far not taken any market access commitments on government procurement in its FTAs. And I mentioned the issue of data over here. Now, the perception in India is totally at variance that EU is an open market. And maybe that perception is totally incorrect because we do not have reliable data. Now, let me ask you one question. I mentioned that in 2007, EU started notifying. Make a guess. Now, instead of you asking me a question, let me ask you a question. Make a guess. What was the percentage of procurement made by the European Union in 2006 from non-EU sources? Anyone wishing to stick his or her neck out on this? Yes.
5%.
Try again.
2%.
3.
Try again.
15%.
Have a go.
1%.
Try again.
0.5%.
Try again, please.
0.001.
Well, it's not that bad. It is 0.37%. I am not making it up. This is based on the official statistics notified by EU to the GPA committee, where it gives details of which entity procures from which country. This was for 2006. Interestingly, when you come to EU's notification in 2007, we see a bland statement saying that, well, our estimate of procurement from non-EU sources is between 2 to 4%. I forget what exact figures is, but certainly it does not exceed 5%. But the basic details which were provided in 2006 notification are not there.
Let me just ask a follow-up question on
Yes.
that, though. But it could very well be that some of the EU buyers could in fact be a foreign subsidiary of a non-EU country. I mean, I'm sure that there are American companies that are establishing their wholly owned subsidiaries.
You're absolutely correct. But the way the notification is required, yeah, you're not going through the supply chain. You're just looking at what is prescribed under the WTO's notification requirement, which says from where did you procure. So going by that logic. So clearly, if the European Union is able to come up with a system which has more transparency in terms of data, there will be a change in perception in India that EU is an open market. As of now, the overwhelming sentiment is that while on paper EU may be open, in effect, in reality, EU is not open to non-EU suppliers. It is as blunt as that. And that may be a reason why you might have in the past experienced some problems with the Indian negotiators. And I believe now the situation has turned a bit. Well, that also reflects on quality of our negotiators, which we shall not discuss now. So, no, they may be good. They may be more practical, pragmatic, more realistic than what the figures suggest. So that is the second reason why India has so far not really looked at a huge export opportunity awaiting its exporters by becoming members to the GPA. Then there are, of course, costs associated with becoming a member. Loss of policy space, costs of changing procurement systems, putting into place a bid challenge procedure, and a reporting mechanism. Overall conclusions, improvements have taken place, no doubt about it. We have moved quite a bit from the situation which prevailed in 2005. The procurement system has increasingly become transparent. And if the public procurement bill eventually gets passed by the parliament, which I hope it does happen, then certainly accountability and probity in the procurement process will improve. And there will certainly be a better ground prepared for India to eventually accede to the GPA. So with that, let me thank all of you for your very kind attention. And I'm open to questions.